Dun.
All right.
Dun, 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 dun.
Welcome
Dun.
in. Welcome back to Revolutionary Roulette. I'm Rob Zielinski. You can find me on Instagram at ZobF37, ZOBF37, or email the show at revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com. And I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Mr. Joshua Catlow.
Good evening. I am Joshua Catlow. You can find me at Facebook, Joshua Patrick. Instagram, the same, Joshua Patrick. And on Twitter, you can find me in arguments amongst Bears fans about how poor Matt Nagy is. And you can find me at Joshua Catlow on Twitter. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining us again. Those of you who have been devoted listeners, we greatly appreciate. We're putting a lot of effort forth into what we're doing here for the last 3 to 4 weeks, and we greatly appreciate your time.
Very well said. And we got plenty of weeks to go as well. So, again, we are covering Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. So this is going to be part 2 of chapter 2, Drawing the Color Line. And before I really dive into it, I just want to clear up one little thing where I've been saying the quote about being anti-racist. So I want to actually give the credit where it's due. So the quote is, in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist. We must be anti-racist. And the quote is directly from Angela Davis. If you don't know who that is, fascinating woman. Go ahead and check her out. She even has speeches, obviously on YouTube, but there's even a Spotify playlist of Angela Davis speeches, as well as many other revolutionaries, like anyone that you can possibly name. Like there's Malcolm X and MLK Jr. So go ahead and check those out.
That is fascinating to learn. Friday, I didn't have anything downloaded book-wise. And for those of you who are not aware, I drive across the central Illinois for a living. And I rode 455 miles on Friday with no audio books, just trying to find radio stations in whatever different town I had. I wish I would have known that about the Angela Davis and other revolutionary figures, so I could have listened to them speak and articulate about what they lived.
Well, now you know. Just download some of that, and you'll be good to go and not eating up your data while you're out on the road.
Can I get it on the free one?
Oh, good question. I'll let you know.
All right, I appreciate that.
So racism is prevalent the world over, but it's arguable that racism has never been so impactful for so long anywhere as it has been in the United States. African-American writer and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois made the phrase "the color line" famous after repeated use in his book, The Souls of Black Folk. But the phrase actually originates from an article titled "The Color Line," which was written by Frederick Douglass in 1881.
You know, one of the things I was thinking of this week is when we were talking about Robert Sweat. And for those of you that don't remember, Robert Sweat was an individual in 1640 who was caught having sex or procreating with a black woman / slave, and they sentenced her to be tied to the whipping post for said relationship. And he had to go serve penance out in front of a church inside the county population, the county lines and things like that. So essentially, for lack of a better word, she caught a beating for having a relationship with someone that also agreed to have it, while he got off by merely having to stand in front of the church and showing public repentance, if you will.
Mhm.
It's just one of them things that I guess when you look at the greater um, aspect of things, both of them in this particular instance got off better than it could have been in the situation. But for some reason, that was weighing on my mind. I wrote it down as my first thing that I wanted to talk about this week because I just couldn't believe it.
Well, that's going to be a really prevalent theme this week. So I'm going to build on that with that context in mind. So we see a color line being drawn there, right? And so starting in 1640, when 6 servants, 5 white and 1 black, tried to run away. The 5 whites got light sentences, and a black man named Emmanuel got 30 whips, was branded in the face with the letter R for runaway, almost like, the scarlet letter A. But
and last week when they were branding with the
right,
the owner's initial.
yeah,
Sorry
except
to
for
interrupt there.
we got the old R right in the face.
Yeah.
And sentenced to work in shackles for a year, or however long the master sees fit, whatever you feel like. So again, this is a color line we can still see today with the 2 different justice systems in the United States. That one being for BIPOC Americans and one for white Americans, and obviously with the Derek Chauvin trial going on today, that's just something to keep in mind. Keep the history in the back of your mind as most people are going to consume that sort of news.
In relation to the Derek Chauvin trial, real quick, just to get it out of the way, it's prominent, so it's not directly in correlation with the words of this book. However, obviously, it goes along the same lines of a lot of the things that are being said in here. But I have a feeling for once that even since his lieutenant has decided to come out and speak against his actions, that maybe, just maybe, this could be the man that they make an example of and put in prison for the murder of George Floyd. And I think that would be a huge, I don't want to say milestone, because there's so many out there that I mean police officers that have killed in the name of injustice. But I feel like making an example out of somebody will be huge and have some of the police officers that don't seem to care think twice before acting, because as of right now, they're kind of floating around. Not kind of, they're floating around doing their own things, and oftentimes it's not by the book, it's unjust, and it's uncalled for. So maybe would I be surprised if he walked and was acquitted? No, but I think this just might be it.
Well, we'll see. That's all I can really say about it right now.
I think that's a fair response to not get into too much depth about it, but yeah, you're right. We've seen this before so many times where there's no way in hell they can let this guy off, and then rioting in the street. So
we still have a lot to cover. So I'm gonna let Zin take over just so we could cover some ground here. And quote, in spite of special subordination of blacks in the Americas in the 17th century, there is evidence that where whites and blacks found themselves with common problems, common work, common enemy in their master, they behaved towards one another as equals. As one scholar of slavery, Kenneth Stamp, has put it, Negro and white servants of the 17th century were remarkably unconcerned about the visible physical differences. Black and white worked together, fraternized together. The fact that the laws had to be passed after a while to forbid such relations indicates the strength of that tendency. In 1661, a law was passed in Virginia that in case any servant shall run away in company of any Negroes, he would have to give special service for extra years to the master of the runaway Negro. In 1691, Virginia provided for the banishment of any white man or woman being free who shall intermarry with a Negro, mulatto, or Indian man or woman bond or free. Lot to unpack there, but the crux of it is that racism isn't natural, right? They saw commonality between each other with their work and how their sort of relationship when it comes to having to face the hard labor that they have to for the master.
Exactly. And even in the book, it says one of the quotes from an overseer was, there's really no proof that they can get along outside of this type of world. Well, that's bullshit, because they've never been given a chance. As soon as they got off the boat, whether it was the whites from Europe or the blacks from Africa, they were immediately put into auctions and brought over to serve as slaves. So they never had a chance to coexist outside of it. And obviously we know the purpose of them coming over or being brought over wasn't for that, but they spoke of it as if there was no chance whatsoever that these two different races, ethnicities could get along whatsoever. It was kind of a weird quote. I didn't understand it.
So yes, there were white servants, but they contractually agreed to work for the masters. They were probably desperate for better quality of life, and they took a chance by signing the contract, which ranged from 4 to 7 years to work as a servant. But again, they had more rights than black slaves and actually had hope for a future as free people once the contract was up. So, however, as the plantation system grew, the need for more labor grew. Cheap or free labor, preferably free. So the number of white people, whether they were indentured servants or free men looking for work, simply was not enough to quell the need for labor to work the sprawling plantations. So, of course, this meant that there was a need for slavery to grow. So in 1700 in Virginia, there were about 6,000 slaves, which that was about 1/12 of the population. And by 1763, so for those of you keeping score at home, that's a mere 63 years later, there were 170,000 slaves, which made up about half the population of Virginia. Soon we're talking about 3 million enslaved black people in the South over the course of 200 years. 200 fucking years of enslavement here.
And if we only knew that was just the beginning, like you try to fathom the 200 years that they were already being servants to unnaturally to people that they did not know, and to think about it, that it could go all the way into the 1900s like it did. And you don't necessarily have to be shackled with chains still to be considered a slave. a lot of people call the subway like a multicultural slave ship. There's a lot of people out there struggling, working for the man, doing all that other types of things. But just the fact that we're going on 400 plus years is absolutely ludicrous. And one of the things that I was referring to in my earlier statement, natural racial repugnance is what they referred to it as, which is just like, there's no fucking way these two people, different groups of people, can get along. It's just not possible. Well, when you come up with terms like natural racial repugnance, it sounds like you never gave it a shot.
Right.
Once again, that doesn't matter because they weren't coming over here to play kumbaya. So.
Right. But the enslaved African Americans never stopped resisting. They worked in the most reprehensible conditions, their bodies being mutilated by masters and by labor, because obviously they weren't working in the safest conditions. And the threat of death by their masters or through sheer exhaustion. Occasionally they did organize insurrections. However, more often they were defiant by running away. And as Zinn puts it, quote, even more often they engaged in sabotage, slowdowns, and subtle forms of resistance, which asserted, if only to themselves and their brothers and sisters, their dignity as human beings. So there's something that just warms my cold, dead heart, right? Because there's something about subtle forms of resistance. It's just a nice little fuck you every chance you get to the white piece of shit master that has stolen your life.
And as if you needed an excuse to root for the people in this particular
Right.
case, it's, you know, that they're going down. If they don't have the energy anymore to physically fight it, or if they're not of a proper age, say they're elders, and well, I can't throw punches at the guy anymore or the man anymore, then I'm going to slow down. I'm going to bring my work to a physical halt. And it got to a point where they were complaining about the actual worth. Some people were considering, we'll get to it a little bit later, I know, but certain slave owners were contemplating whether slavery was even worth it financially because of how much they put a stop to their labor and demanded change, which makes you feel good in the depths of your soul for those of us that have them.
I'll give you those details in a little bit, and obviously not on this scale, but a lot of us can relate to that, right? Especially if you've worked a job that pays by the hour. You know, you try to steal some company time. Maybe you take a half-hour bathroom break and you just doom scroll on your phone in the stall. You find corners to cut for stupid shit that you hate doing, you know, is completely irrelevant to what you need to be doing, or you drag your feet doing a job that, you know, should take you an hour. Instead, you turn it into a half-day task, you know, something like that. Those are our sort of modern subtle forms of resistance.
Exactly. Or when your company refuses to pay for any of your PPE and you've been an essential employee since day one, you decide to go into an Aldi on your work hour during the time and keep yourself on the books and do some shopping for breakfast and LaCroix and other necessities that you'll need throughout the week, even though you're on company time. Not that that's a direct quote or anything, but
oddly specific, man.
Yeah, so it's happened.
So there was a plot in 1687 Virginia, quote, in which slaves planned to kill all the whites in the area and escape during a mass funeral. So let's flash back a little bit here. The Africans did fight from the get-go. They resisted getting captured, as we discussed. If they ended up on a boat that didn't have anything to shackle them down, they would jump into the Atlantic and keep themselves underwater to drown. They knew the horrors that they could face in the new world, and decided to go out on their own terms if possible. But if they did face the horrors, they would be disobedient at every possible turn.
Yeah, it was pretty much by any means necessary was their way of getting even with the overseers and the slave owners for putting them in this predicament. Which, can you blame them? The answer is no.
Right. So in 1503, when the first black slaves were brought to Hispaniola, the governor of Hispaniola bitched to the Spanish court that fugitive slaves were teaching Indians to be disobedient. Excuse me, if it does please the court, runaway slaves are teaching Indians who aren't Indian, because we're not in fucking India, to be bad people. So can you please do something about this, please, Madre?
And it was shortly after that when the people of Hispaniola started complaining, which is modern day Cuba, I believe, that they came up with a specific group of people to only track and capture and hunt, if you will, runaway slaves at this time, just specifically for that purpose whatsoever, their own policing system, if you will.
I will, and we're gonna touch more on that later on. So that was in 1503. By the 1520s and 30s, there were slave revolts up and down the Caribbean. But because of these fugitive uprisings, the Spanish formed a police force to chase and capture down these rebellious slaves. And, that's right. The very first police force was created to hunt down black fugitives and re-enslave them for their free labor. Doesn't get much more racist than that, and that's the basis of police systems.
I mean, a lot of things have changed since 1530. Obviously, one of the
we got computers now, watering cans.
This is true. Jack White as well. A lot of things have changed since 1530. I guess that's the most silly comment I'll hopefully say throughout this podcast. But just the fact that they dedicated a group of people time, wealth, and man hours to something. I feel like I'm stepping on toes here because to make the point, I got to jump ahead, but
go ahead.
I'm going to do it anyway. James Madison, later on in this chapter, which we'll get to, spoke of that he can get about $257 for each enslaved individual that he sells on the auction yard or the slave block. And it costs him about $12 to $13 an hour to do so. And then you have
a year, 12 or 13 a year. Yeah.
Excuse me. I apologize. In upkeep is the way they phrased it. It costs them $12 to $13 in upkeep a year. So for them to devote all that much time, power, energy, man hours, instead of just letting them live and try and fight for a better life. I mean, I get it. That's the exact opposite of what they were trying to do, but there was constantly new slaves being brought in. You kind of feel like maybe if they were able to get past, if they were able to run away, why would you expend that much money to try and capture them and bring them back? I don't know.
Right.
Just a thought.
Yeah, it's just it's wrong on so many levels. James Madison, who's the fucking father of the Constitution, that's what they, dubbed him as later on. Fourth president of the United States, told his British buddy who was visiting, shortly after the American the Revolutionary War. These details, so that calculates to about $350 a year for a keep, and about $7,350 that he's making. So that's 7,000 profit every year on every single slave. So he had about 100 slaves. Motherfucker was making $700,000 a year just on the backs of slave labor. Such a fucking piece of shit. Like,
and that's when you get into things later on in life, which generational wealth.
Right.
It's just, you can set aside money when you have what I dub fuck it money, and make your family set for life when black people have never even had this opportunity. And it goes from James Madison making all this money off of slavery. It goes from, I forget the name of the gentleman, but he bought weapons and sold what he knew were faulty weapons that misfired and ended up killing their users. So he bought the weapons at $17 a pop and sold them to a black infantry in the Civil War for, I believe it was $42 a pop, and ended up killing about 56 people to go along with it. So it's like the scumbaggery that it's just unbelievable. How
scumbaggery. Yeah. He sounds like Butler from Gone with the Wind. You know, he's just selling, making all this money playing both sides and just collecting all the greenbacks.
I must admit, I know that goes along with what we're talking about in this book, but I've never seen the movie. Maybe I'll do that as soon as we get off.
Okay. So we're still in like the 1700s here. We'll pick up the pace a bit. So slave trade is still bringing Africans to North America, and these people would try to run away in groups together and try to establish camps on the frontier. But slaves who were born in America were likely to run away by themselves using whatever skills they learned while enslaved and trying to pass as free people, especially if they escape to the north. So in a 1729 report to the British Board of Trade, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia, he describes how 15 slaves banded together and planned to escape their master and set themselves up in the mountains. They collected guns and ammo. They packed some provisions, tools, clothes, and bedding. Unfortunately, it didn't work out. So, quote, "This attempt has happily been defeated. It ought nevertheless to awaken us into some effectual measures." So that sucks.
You were speaking of American-born versus African-brought slaves. The ones that were American-born and then grew up into slavery were more apt to try and run away and fit in to modern day cultures to live as free men and women, as to where the ones that were shipped directly from Africa, probably merely months or within a few years of being brought over, tried to kind of live off their survival instincts in the forests and things like that. So no matter how you went about it, you were obviously using whatever instinct you had in you to get away, even though it didn't work out very often.
That's right.
As you find out.
But the subtle forms of resistance really did fuck with other masters and their plantation and county records and advertisements in newspapers for runaways, for these, receipts, as well as actual slave owners' words, like Landon Carter, who contemplated, as you mentioned before, whether or not slaves were worth having because they neglected their tasks and were just so uncooperative, so that they would either not work or could not work. So going back to that was it was Landon Carter who was like, man, these guys just don't want to work for me. I mean, why?
I hate diving back into political, but this guy, all I could think of today while I was doing notes, by the way, which I'm not doing great with, the fact that I have everything written down instead of just listening to it, I'm struggling. So please forgive me, folks. But all I could think of today when I was taking notes was this fucking guy, Landon Carter, is the modern day model Donald Trump. He's the only asshole that can make slavery not work for him. And all I kept fucking equating that to was Donald Trump is the only fucking cocksucker in the face of this earth that can make not one, but two fucking casinos go bankrupt. People beg to get in there to lose their fucking paychecks, and you have two fucking casinos go bankrupt on the fucking Atlantic Ocean in New Jersey, you piece of shit cocksucker. So yeah, I'm sure Landon Collins is a fucking relative of yours.
And yeah, it makes
Finn.
it makes me think of Trump building Trump Tower and hiring a bunch of Polish laborers, Zelensky, and then just stiffing them. So, so because the South was able to sustain slavery for 200 years and there were so few organized rebellions, some historians try to paint the enslaved, as Stanley Elkins puts it, a society of helpless dependence. However, if we look at the subtle forms of resistance every single fucking day, we know that's not true. It's just that everything and everybody, especially in the government, was against them. The master tried to break them through hard labor, separating them from their families. I mean, that sounds familiar. And turn the slaves against each other by separating them into more privileged house slaves and then the backbreaking work of the field slaves.
It was there were laws put into place in 18th century Virginia when it came to the flight and rebellion of slaves. You would see constant ads and records in newspapers describing slaves that were lazy or feigning illness. They purposely destroyed the crops, stores, tools, and sometimes attacked and killed the overseers as well. Well, what the fuck do you expect them to do? It's right. Like you don't just sit there and abide by what you're being told when you know deep down it's wrong. Nobody's going to outwardly admit that this was wrong, especially when you're the benefactor of all these things. But wouldn't you think down in the cockles of their heart somewhere they would know that what they're doing is completely ass backwards? I don't know. And then the fact that Virginia would put into force laws soon thereafter that would go against them trying to free themselves just makes it even worse. Allowing individuals to bring back escaped slaves by any way they deemed necessary to their owners was just
right. So the laws were against them and trying to intimidate them, right? So it was law that Black people couldn't gather in large groups for fear of organized slave revolt. Up in Boston, the Boston Council, well, I'll just read a quote here. Boston Council quote ruled that any slaves who on their own gathered in groups of 2 or more were to be punished by whippings. And it's like, what the fuck, 2 or more?
Yeah.
That's 2. So 2 fucking people couldn't just chat together. Like, get the fuck out of here. What?
Man, my ass is a dickhead, man. You couldn't even do that. Like, how do you? It's
right. You can't. You're not even supposed to just be like, yeah, man, it's fucking
you're
hot
supposed
out.
to be an individual. And the fact that they tried to take family away from these people is even more pathetic, because it's like you don't even need to go into depths of it. It's just it's outlandish.
Yeah. So if we'll say, like, if a slave ran away and was caught, the county court could order dismemberment as punishment, or again, do whatever unthinkable things to the recaptured slave, and terrifying others from the like practices, as it was written into the Virginia Slave Code that you mentioned.
As we spoke of earlier in making an example out of Derek Chauvin, having slaves being hanged and then quartered was used to the advantage of the slave owner to try and make an example of runaways. You hit the road, this is what's going to happen to you.
Mm-hmm.
And they would leave them hanging in the trees and swinging just so people would spark fear, which obviously it would. I mean, your life's on the line every day, but sooner or later you get that fuck it mentality and you're just like, you got to do it.
You mentioned, lynchings and hangings. Do yourself a favor, go ahead and check out the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday.
Okay.
So between the years 1736 and 1801, there were newspaper ads for like 1,100 men and 140 women runaways. And the most consistent reason for running away was the need to find their family members. So as you mentioned, even if you get caught, the slave could face mutilation or death. They risk getting back together with their family. And, as a family man, that really hits home, as I'm sure it does. It probably tugs at the heartstrings of just about anybody.
I don't have a family, and it makes me angry. So
Right.
I can only imagine those who were longing for a hug or the simple eye contact from somebody they love, that just needed that to help them get through. Like, we talk about trying to get through our days now with just our 9 to 5s, and then we get to come home and live our lives.
Right.
These people were trapped like animals daily, in and out, and you take away the one part of their being that makes it worthwhile. So.
Right. So there are accounts of masters being killed by women slaves. Leave it to women to get shit popping, right?
They always be behind every good woman is a good woman, or whatever the quote is. Behind every good man, there's a great woman. All of them are true. Fuck it. But yeah, they would find a way to get shit done, and it's like, okay.
I see you. So then you just kind of ride the wave. And so sometimes they would just set homes or the tobacco houses on fire. Maybe the master gets a little too drunk one night, has a little too much to drink, and he's not going to wake up for shit. So maybe you accidentally drop a couple candles on a pile of newspapers, or on dried tobacco leaves, and in the morning they can only identify the master by his yellow fucking teeth. These accidents happen all the time.
It's very a natural occurrence. So and then when you were speaking of the women, they would find a way to put a little something in their drink, Bill Cosby style.
That's
So
right.
whatever you got to do, um, first the pudding and the poop and sorry, but they got a little bit of revenge extracted, and it's not even so much about revenge. Strike that. It's about just trying to get away. So
Uh, the uprisings continue to happen, not a lot, but enough to where there was a constant fear of a rebellion, the fear among the masters. So I just want to start with this. There's so many individual stories. There was about 250 total rebellions where there were 10 or more slaves who were banded together or just conspiring to get something going. So from Zinn, at Stono, South Carolina in 1739, about 20 slaves rebelled. 2 killed warehouse guards, stole guns and gunpowder, and headed south, killing people in their way and burning buildings. They were joined by others until there were perhaps 80 slaves in all. And according to one account of the time, they called out liberty, marched on with colors displayed, and 2 drums beating. The militia found and attacked them. In the ensuing battle, perhaps 50 slaves and 25 whites were killed before the uprising was crushed. So there's just story after story about these uprisings, and a lot of these accounts can be found in greater detail in the book American Negro Slave Revolts by Herbert. I think it's Aptheker. He's the one who describes those 250 rebellions in greater detail.
It was the constant heart and fight through the outlandish situations that were put in is really what makes it moving. And a lot of people talk about that fighting spirit when it comes to even modern day Black folk and where they get it from. And it's a beautiful thing to have pride in where you came from, even though it can be such an awful place for certain individuals, that you could still pull from it the better parts of it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. So again, sometimes even the whites joined in the slavery resistance mix. Poor Blacks and whites conspired together after a harsh New York winter in 1741, and mysterious fires broke out. And after a completely lopsided trial, 18 slaves were hanged and 13 were burned alive. A total of 4 white people, 2 men, and 2 women were also executed.
There was one particular individual who was put on a spit and made of public display and roasted for 8 to 10 hours. I think roasted is a improper term, but my vocabulary does not give me a word that can describe the hatred it must take to have inside you to do that to another human being. So that's the last we'll speak of that part.
So in the new American colonies, besides the fear of a Black person rebellion, what was the one fear greater than that? That Black slaves and discontented white people would band together and overthrow the existing order. So this meant even more measures needed to be taken to cause more of a rift between white and Black people. What the Virginia ruling class did was pass another law. This one required masters to give white indentured servants whose time was up 30 shillings, 10 bushels of corn, and a gun. White women received 40 shillings and 15 bushels of corn, but no gun. And all white indentured servants were given 50 acres of land.
And so much for the black folks who have been promised 40 acres and a mule for God knows how long. But
Right. So
I'll let you talk to Spike Lee about that.
So I'm gonna again let Zin kind of take over for a bit here, because this is really important. This is we're wrapping up the chapter here, and this is we're gonna see this is this is key. We see now a complex web of historical threads to ensnare blacks for slavery in America. The desperation of starving settlers, the special helplessness of the displaced African, the powerful incentive of profit for slave trader and planter, the temptation of superior status for poor whites, the elaborate controls against escape and rebellion, the legal and social punishment of black and white collaboration. So it means only that there is a possibility for something else under historical means, only that under conditions that have not yet been realized. And one of these conditions would be the elimination of class exploitation, which has made poor whites desperate for small gifts of status and has prevented the unity of black and white necessary for joint rebellion and reconstruction. He's describing a sort of class consciousness. Again, rich versus poor, and we're talking. This is going on back in the 1600s, 1700s, and it's an issue we're still facing today when we talk about resources not being properly allocated amongst the people.
It's no coincidence that you can tie everything into this book into modern day times, and class consciousness is just a white man's word for to try and make things seem as if they're going to make a more just society. But in all actuality, nothing changes if nothing changes.
So we're gonna have to make those changes. Again, this is third week in a row we're mentioning it. Somehow, some way, something has to get done, and there seems like there's something that we can take away when you read about a sort of joint rebellion and reconstruction between white people, black people, when it comes to this book. And now we're talking the United States is such a melting pot now, with our Latinx brothers and sisters, Asian brothers and sisters. So it's not just a black and white thing anymore. It's a white and all BIPOC Americans. And racist white people need to understand that it's not it's not the colored people, it's not the people of color, it's not BIPOC Americans who are fucking up your flow. It's the people at the top. Like, we need to stop punching down or laterally. You need to look at the corporate overlords and punch up. Stop punching down just because there's some sort of racial division in your mind.
If we were to tax the richest 1%, we would be able to solve hunger in the United States 10 times over. And I'm not even talking about taxing at an outlandish rate like some people want to do, like 50%. If you're,
I say go with the 50%.
That's fine.
There should be no billionaires. Why does there's no need to be a billionaire? You could be a 999 millionaire and have generational wealth. There's no need for billionaires.
Billionaires can bring in upwards of 87 to $100 million alone by just having their money work for them within 1 year. That's unbelievable. And that's at modest rates, like 5%. There's a good follow on Twitter, Jesse Mechanic, who goes into a lot of these specifics when it comes to taxing the rich, healthcare, a lot of what you would call the liberal agenda, even though it's not radical liberal agenda, it's just humanitarianism trying to peek its head out and give people a fighting chance. And when you said punching down, we need to start punching upwards, you kind of wonder when people will realize that there really is no chance. They've eradicated, let me rephrase. They've essentially come close to getting rid of the middle class. So now you have the upper and the lower, and trying to find a common ground or evening the playing field is an absolutely ridiculous task to even think about doing. And it just makes it that much more difficult to go about your daily routine, and especially for those of us who are struggling with financial situations and things like that. But I'm sorry, I guess at this point I'm just rambling, but
so I mean, I would add on, for the racist, not just Americans, the people out there, you are closer, in the class with your BIPOC Americans,
with the people you hate.
Yes. And it just doesn't make sense to be mad, upset, and have these bigoted views towards these people of color when you're in the same class. It doesn't compute. Like, the people at the top need to be paying their fair share. It pisses me off.
The same with churches.
I thinking about it, but it pisses me off.
The same with churches, and the same with charitable organizations that take advantage of loopholes, i.e., Goodwill and others. But I guess you and I have talked about how Bernie Sanders is considered a radical, and I know this has nothing to do with the book, but
we're done with chapter 2, by the way. That's literally closing the book on chapter 2.
Perfect. And I apologize to you guys. I did not have it today. And I blame that on actually being diligent and taking notes instead of just listening to the chapter and then coming off the cuff, which is what I appear to be better at. So I apologize for my lack of. Rob, you put me on your shoulders this evening, and I appreciate that. But what I'm getting at, in regards to the I don't even remember what I was talking about.
Well, we only have a couple more minutes left. Maybe you could feed it off this. My last point would be that racism, as we've seen through the eyes of this chapter, racism isn't natural. Modern racism is the result of centuries of certain situations and conditions being perpetuated along generational racism that we discussed last week, that we learned from family, friends, and community. Also, not to mention the systemic racism in American economics and policies.
You and I'll have to discuss this offline at some point, but I genuinely feel that everybody is racist deep down inside. Um, whether it comes from uh, what you've learned growing up or how it was instilled in you, um, it's not natural. I agree with you 100% when you say that. It's not something that is born into you, but it is something that is definitely taught. But because of the way the world works and the way the world runs, everybody has some amount of racism in them. And it's what they do to address that that makes all the difference in the world. So somebody that you look at as a an elder or a pillar of the community or whatever, um, I can guarantee you, even the strongest of the strong, the most um, the people that care the most have even had their moments of weaknesses when it comes to race and agendas.
Sure.
I guess is what I'm trying to spit out.
No, yeah, that it makes sense, but again, that's why I feel like this country, especially, needs to find that class consciousness and let go of all the bigoted views. It doesn't do anybody any good. It's just hatred living in your heart. And again, what this is all about, love, and we're doing this so that we can try to educate ourselves and others close to us, and hopefully, expand that reach. But this is just, it's to spread the love, man. Like, to not sound like a complete hippie or anything, but it's like, let's just fucking love each other. It would make everything so much easier, and everybody would have just an abundance of everything, of wealth, everything. Everybody would be taken care of the way that's necessary. Everyone, deserves a right to a house, to food, to medical care, and America doesn't have that. We have, houseless people. We have people who are food insecure. We have people who their lives have been destroyed because they don't make that much money, and one little accident has put them in such debt that they can't buy a house. They can't, get the car that they want. It actually, it's convoluted, and it's really layered, but we just
there's a lot of people out there
and stop hoarding it at the top.
There's a lot of people out there that are one insurance deductible away from being in really deep shit.
Right.
So it's just something to keep in mind. And whether you make $40,000 a year like myself and struggle to get by, whether you make $150,000 a year and have some of the nicer things and a better house and don't live in a shithole apartment, there's really no difference between us as the way that the government and the 1% view us. We're essentially the same individual to them. It's just one pays a little bit more taxes, and in most cases, it's the person with the least amount of money.
That's exactly right. So we have about a minute left, so we're just gonna say our goodbyes. Next week will be chapter 3, which is persons of mean and vile condition. So check us next week. Re-listen to this as a podcast. We're everywhere: Spotify, Google Podcast. If you want to reach out, just hit us on our socials, which we mentioned at the beginning of the show, or just email us at revolutionaryroulette@gmail.com.
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us. I greatly appreciate it. Like I said, Rob and I put a lot of individual work, although it didn't seem like I did that this evening. I am grateful beyond belief for those of you who've supported us and who have listened. It means the world because this isn't some bullshit that we're just talking sports or talking random BS that doesn't matter. This is actually life-changing stuff. So thank you from the bottom of my heart, and I'm sure Rob feels the same way without trying to put words in his mouth, but we appreciate you, and I promise to give you a better effort next week.
Ditto. Love you guys.